morning. I'm Lisa DeSisto. I'm the publisher of the Portland Press Herald. Welcome to the Portland Public Library. Thank you, Sarah, for hosting us. Thank you very much. We are here to have a conversation about broadband, and while those of us who live in the greater Portland area may take our high-speed access for granted, it is not the same experience for those across the state, and certainly something that we've been talking about as a key to economic prosperity. And with that, I will turn it over to our business reporter, Craig Anderson.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. In the Portland area, I think we all can be fairly satisfied with our internet service, but that is not, at least we have access here, and that is not the case for some parts of Maine, and it's a problem for communities, not just because the internet is a prominent source of entertainment. It's also a tool for economic development. It's a tool for education, for healthcare, and all the folks at this table are among those that are trying to figure out ways to bring those services to the communities that need them. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of introduce everyone real briefly by name and title, and then I'm going to have each of them explain just really quickly what their organization is doing to try to help this problem, and then we'll get into some questions. So immediately to my left here, I have Tracy Scheckel, who's the Marketing and Public Relations Manager for Otelco. And then next to her, we have Fletcher Kittredge, who's the CEO of GWI. And then finally on the end, we have Peggy Schaffer, the Executive Director of ConnectME. So Tracy, would you start maybe and tell us a little bit about yourself and what Otelco is doing in Maine?
Sure. Otelco is essentially a DBA for a multitude of incumbent local exchange carriers, which basically serve an exchange, for example, 657 in Gray. And those companies were founded about 100 years ago by farmers and businessmen when the big companies wouldn't come and serve rural areas because they couldn't make a business case to do it. And so, ironically, we're in the same boat today where broadband is concerned because it's expensive to put fiber to the premise in. Probably $30,000 a mile is a good estimate, and when there's 5 or 6 people that live along that mile, the return on investment is difficult. So we are striving to do that, but trying to do it with the help of communities who are now starting to take things in their own hands. So we go on, and we do this in Maine and Alabama and Missouri and West Virginia and Vermont and Massachusetts.
Thanks, Tracy. How about you, Fletcher? Want to tell us a little bit about?
GWI funds, builds, and operates fiber optic networks, and from a national perspective, primarily in rural areas. So,
great. And Peggy, tell us about ConnectME.
So ConnectME is the state authority to bring to help bring broadband to unserved areas of the state. Our current definition of unserved is people who have less than 25 megabytes per second over 3. And we do that by providing 2 kinds of grants. We have a community planning grant, which helps the community sort of talk to each other and figure out what they want and what they have and work with providers. And then we have an infrastructure grant, which has been our sort of traditional grant, which provides which provides companies or communities a chance to get a little extra money to hopefully fill the gap in that financing piece to bring broadband to people who are unserved. Up until last year, our unserved rate was, I think we were 1.5 over 7, so basically nothing over nothing. And we changed that this past year because, technology changes, needs changes, and we know that we need to expand the availability of good broadband in the state.
So maybe, Peggy, you could start with giving us the landscape here. Why does Maine rank so low for internet connectivity, and what are the challenges that are preventing us from doing better?
Well, so, I talk with a lot of national people, and we're all competing for that 49th space, all the rural states, all of us. You go to any meeting, 49. And they all say, my state is the 49th in the country. So I would say that rural Maine is not unique. This is a national problem across the country. So it isn't that we're so far behind anybody else. We're, I think, probably a little ahead of other people because we, in fact, do have a ConnectME authority, though our funding is little bits of money. But so the fact that we have authority in place, the fact that we've been building these relationships with communities and with providers since 2006 actually puts us in sort of a better place. You know, Maine has challenges. It's distance and people, and we have a lot of distance and not a lot of people. And you know, some of the solutions that have worked in bigger, flatter places like wireless don't work that well in Maine because we have these things that Greg Sweetser loves. They're called mountains. And so that sort of hinders some of the technology that works, that may work in other places that may not work in Maine. But, you know, we're making progress, but we still have a lot of dark holes in Maine.
I see. And maybe Tracy, you could help us with this one. Why should we care that Maine ranks so low? Like, what's the big deal with, and why is it an issue?
I would have to say for the same issue that electrification and telephone was at the turn of the 20th century and beyond, that brought about a quality of life and place for people in rural America. It helped economic development, and today it's broadband. You know, it's communication, it's education, it's telemedicine, aging in place, being able to telecommute, being able to work where you live, which is, you know, what people are looking for right now. And so it's as important to infrastructure as electric and telephone were. And so I think that's the main issue.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, this one I think everyone might have their own opinions about, but let's start with you, Fletcher. Let's talk about what can private industry do to help solve this problem? What can government do? What can the state do? What can local governments do? What do you see as each of their sort of ideal roles in solving this problem?
3 hours.
No.
We'll just
all right. I mean,
Try to keep it brief.
have some faith. All of Maine can be divided into 3 parts. When it comes to this, there's the part that the networks needs to be upgraded, but it's private money can do it because there's a rate of return. There's a part that private money isn't as interested in, but it eventually will pay for itself. Because one of the things about broadband makes it not like roads is people are used to paying user fees for it, so it generates cash. And the third is the part of Maine that is so sparsely populated that it's going to require initial government pump priming, but probably ongoing subsidy. And this is the same. Those same things, by the way, are true for power and for telephone. Mm-hmm. So we have models that work for that. So one of the things, the fundamental message that I would like to hammer home is this is something that changes every single day. This is technology. It's not you do broadband and you're done. There's a constant need to over time upgrade systems. But we've reached the point where one of the things that's happened is it's starting really to be financially viable for many parts of Maine, including some of the rural areas, to just do it with private money. And that's the big change that we've seen, I'd say, in the last 24 to 18 months. And because these things take 4 or 5 years, I think you're going to start seeing the results of that over the next 2 or 3 years.
I see. Peggy, what about the role of government? What do you think the state in particular should be doing, and what should local governments be doing?
Well, I think there's sort of 3 pieces to that. One is, I mean, broadband is an economic development tool. So just like many other programs that the state has for economic development, we try to fill in the gap, whether that's money or whatever, to help those projects happen. And so there's lots of levers around that gap of money. Some of it is pole attachment, making that a little easier. Some of it is trying to, I lost my train of thought, I need more coffee. So the role that we can play is trying to drive use. And that's digital literacy, it's expanding telemedicine, it's the education gap, it's workforce stuff. There's a whole variety of things that government can help with in terms of pushing out better use, which drives a revenue stream because people take the service. We can fill in the gap of financing when financing doesn't occur. And local municipalities are also playing part of that role. We don't see the state as being the whole shebang for these small builds or these rural builds. We see it as a partnership between the community that we're in, maybe the federal government, the state, and the private players, creating a partnership, just like any other business venture, that allows this economic activity to happen.
Can I?
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay.
Please jump in, anyone, when you're ready.
Three key things about that. The first of all is the importance of digital literacy, and I would add digital inclusion as the second thing.
What does that mean exactly?
Okay. Digital inclusion is these networks are reshaping society, and basically they don't have access to them. You're really getting left out. And there's so part of digital inclusion is making sure everyone has access to them. The other part is making sure everybody can afford them, because the people who get the biggest bang of the buck, and society's biggest bang for the buck, is on the low end. Mm-hmm. If you could train up the bottom 15% of society to really understand how to use these things and have them available in a way they can afford, what's going to happen to them is just going to reduce a lot of spending on social programs and that sort of stuff.
I see.
So those two things. The third thing is what you said earlier about how this is a national problem. And my sense of what's happening is because it's a national problem, there is enough bipartisan momentum so that federal funding is ratcheting up in a way that you haven't seen before. For all the reasons that private money is starting to drive in, it's starting to drive federal money. And you know, no promises, but it looks like there are several orders of magnitude the amount of state and federal funding available for this. So we're going to make a lot of progress, I believe.
Maybe we'll get to 48th.
Really good.
Depends on how good we are as a state going after that federal funding. And that is one of the things that's driven us to the bottom. Look at the people. Look at Vermont, my God. They have gotten so much federal money to build their network.
So Tracy, what can advancements in technology do to help us solve this problem? Have there been some recent advancements in the tech that's used to connect these rural areas that could maybe help us?
You know, we hear a lot of buzz about 5G and satellite, and the bottom line, at least from our perspective, is that fiber today, we don't even know its capabilities, and its capabilities far exceed any of the other technology out there. It's more durable and, in our opinion, future-proof because, like I said, we don't even know what it's capable of, but are confident that over the course of time, as we learn more about its capabilities, that's going to be the way to go.
Is there a sense that that technology will come down in the cost of implementing it over time?
That's a really good question. I'm not one would think that as things become more used and more established, they do, but whether you're hanging it on poles or pulling it through the ground, I don't know that those prices will actually come down. The fiber itself is not the expensive part, it's the installation.
I see. So yeah, I guess the cost of labor is a whole different issue. And since Tracy mentioned 5G, Fletcher, I know you went on the Broadband Coalition listserv with this long screed about 5G isn't going to save us, and I was wondering if you could explain what are the technical challenges involved in 5G?
I didn't say 5G wouldn't save us, but there are two things that are key in this conversation about 5G. The first is it requires fiber density. The part of 5G did not repeal the laws of physics, and part of the way it works is to have it shortens the distance between the receiver and the transmitter. So your cell tower is in the room, in the building, or very close to you. And the only way it works is if those cell towers, those antennas are attached to fiber, because you need the speed of the backhaul to do that. So that's number one. Number two is the density and the cost of 5G antennas and antenna sites are such that in areas where the population is not dense, it does not make financial sense to put in the antennas. So it's going to have less of an impact in rural areas, much less impact in rural areas than it will in cities, and you're probably not going to get the speeds and the reliability that people talk about anywhere except for downtown Portland and other downtown locations for literally a decade, and probably not ever. So those are two things to remember. But 5G is really, really important, and it will change everything.
Wow. Are there any other sort of emerging technologies or technologies that haven't been really rolled out that people are looking to as a possible, facilitator of broadband connections in rural areas in the future?
I would say the thing that people are mostly pointing to is that it doesn't look like there's a flattening of the bandwidth demand curve yet. So we're going to go to gigabit, we're going to go beyond gigabit, I would say today power is still more important than the internet, though it's getting to be pretty much a tie. And that will change as, we use power for everything. We use electricity for everything. So many things and all the things in your home that use electricity are probably going to end up having an internet connection, the Internet of Things, and the way that is going to drive bandwidth.
I can't wait for my smart toaster.
Yeah, right. The way that that's going to drive, one of the drivers of bandwidth is you see that, but that looks like it's driving new protocols. So instead of GPON, it's, NGX PON or something like that, and it's 10 megabits, not 1 megabit. That's not really I don't think of that as a big thing.
Yeah. Peggy, here's a good question for you. So we do have one advantage in Maine, which is we have an internet fiber backbone, a dark fiber backbone that runs through a lot of these rural communities called the three-ring binder. What is the role of that, and how has that helped? I think a lot of people kind of get the sense that the three-ring binder hasn't really been utilized to its potential. But what do you think about that?
So, the internet is not magic. These things it's not like pixie dust. It's not. I mean, I had this conversation frequently. It isn't pixie dust. It has to be connected to something. And so what the three-ring binder has done is provided a big fat tube.
A series of tubes?
No, just one. Anyway, a series. To parts of the state that didn't, and it's open access, which means that providers can get on it. And it's non-discriminatory, which means that everybody gets on it sort of at the same rate. And so that has leveled the playing field and allowed rural providers access to a pipe that they didn't previously have access to. So there are a lot of our small rural providers, Pioneer Broadband, Premium Choice, and many, many others who have used that three-ring binder to bring fiber, to bring internet to parts of the state that otherwise really would not be able to have access to it. And so it has made a significant difference. In terms of, is it used enough? That's a conversation I really hate, because it's, we built it. It was built to be big, to maximize or to allow capacity in the future. And you remember, this was built as a result of the recession. And so it's taken Maine...
Built with economic stimulus funds, right? Yeah.
Right. It's taken Maine a little while to rise from that recession. So we are seeing our economy come back, and we're also seeing, as Fletcher said, the drive for broadband now increasing and accelerating. So I don't think we know that I don't think it's underutilized. I don't think it will be underutilized in the future. think that's sort of a misnomer that people had put out there when it got built, but I think it's an integral part of how we're going to expand broadband in this state.
We just learned that last week that the administrator of the network has changed. The original management company, which was Maine Fiber Company, was purchased by a company based out of Albany called First Light. Does that change anything? I probably should start with Peggy on that, because I think you're in the best position to know sort of what are the implications of that ownership change.
So Maine Fiber was never the administrator. Maine Fiber was the owner.
The owner.
And so Maine Fiber is a private company, and it sold its stock to another private company, Oxford Networks, which is here in Maine. They've been here in Maine they used to be Oxford Networks, now they're First Light. So they've been here in Maine for a long time, and they actually serve a lot of Western Maine. And so this is a private company that was bought by another private company. And the grant requirements are that they have to retain the intention of the asset for the life of the asset, which is about 20 years. So as far as we know, I mean, this just happened last week. The conversations we've had with both First Light and Maine Fiber is that things are going to remain the same for now. I mean, that's just, it's a private company that bought a private company. They're both here in Maine. This idea that, Oxford Networks is from away, or excuse me, First Light is from away is not really, they're here in Maine, and they're active in Maine. They're all over Western Maine.
Tracy, do you have any thoughts on it?
I do. We, Otelco, and Pine Tree Network, before Otelco and Mid-Maine and Saco, have been working with the former Oxford for years. I mean, we actually tout the fact that we have what we call a friendly co-opetition, which means we buy bandwidth from them where we need it, they buy connectivity from us where they need it. Since they became First Light, that relationship hasn't changed, and since Maine Fiber has existed, we've done the same thing. We have 80 gig running around the top ring of the 3-ring binder. And those relationships have been fine. And as Peggy said, they're bound by the grant agreement to begin with, and we don't expect anything to change. We're looking forward to it.
That's great. I mean, I guess there's always some trepidation when something changes, but yeah, I've spoken with them, and they seem committed to this idea of openness and impartiality. So I think we've laid out the problem pretty well here. There are obviously many facets to it, but I'd like to. I know that there are some communities, some projects out there where they are coming up with solutions and figuring out how to overcome these problems. And Fletcher, I know you're involved with some of those. Can you talk about sort of what are the models that communities can adopt to try to, jumpstart this bringing of internet service to their folks?
So the first thing I'd say is you're absolutely right. There are some models, and this is a national problem. And one thing I think for communities to do is look outside the state of Maine, because there are hundreds of communities that are bootstrapping one way or another. There are I can think of 3 in particular in Maine that we hold up as models. One is Islesboro, which is an island community that desperately needed broadband because they were teetering on the edge of losing their year-round community because they couldn't attract young people. And they also had high property values. So what they did is they did a essentially property tax funded network that is just absolutely amazing. And the most amazing thing about it is its universal service. Meaning that well over 90% of the town is connected via gigabit symmetrical connections because they used their municipal ownership to leverage making sure it was affordable to everyone. So they just absolutely nailed digital inclusion. It's not universal availability, it's universal availability and universal service where people really can get it and use it. Another example is South Portland, where we actually own the network, but the city acted as a municipal anchor tenant connecting their buying fiber to connect all their municipal buildings and public safety and this thing and that thing. That was done about 5 years ago. Every year since then, we've been expanding the network, and it's mostly in partnership with them or with the local community college or someone. And so that's another example. And that is just the government using their buying power to prime the pump, to give us an anchor tenant, so we had a good sense that we were going to at least reach break even or something close to break even just from that one tenant. And then it's extended to businesses and residential customers. Then Sanford has gotten federal funding, and they built, what they did is they extended the 3-ring binder to Sanford. It's a 36-mile build, and then they built a ring around their community, and they are primarily focused at business connectivity, and they use federal, they own the network, but they use federal funds to pay for it.
Peggy, if I'm one of...
Can I give one?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
The other thing that we did a couple of years ago, the state did a couple of years ago, is we allowed these creations of broadband utilities. And so essentially what we did was we stuck, so there's a statute that allows for the creation of sewer and water districts, and we just stuck in that statute that you could do it for broadband too. So Down East Broadband, which is Calais and Baileyville, have joined together to create a broadband utility. They've run 87 miles of fiber to those two communities. They've used the utility district model to secure a Community Reinvestment Act loan from the bank up there, from a bank up there. And the towns came in with money mostly as a backup in case the system doesn't make it in the first 5 years. They can fill in some of the whatever revenue gaps can happen. They contracted with a local provider to design it and build it. They've contracted with somebody else to run it. It's going to be an open access. They've got at least one provider who's interested. They may have others. And so that is a model of how communities can come together to create just like a water sewer district, a broadband district to bring broadband to their communities.
Am I correct in my understanding that the difference between that and what Fletcher described is that there's no private partner that's running the network? Is that the difference?
It's really the same. By and large, it's the same model, just with some tweaks. I think there are two key things about it. The first is this utility district. It doesn't make much sense, particularly for a small rural town, to go alone. And it's just so much more viable if you stick a region together, or 3 or 4 towns. And getting towns to work with each other is just painful. But it depends. I mean, look at rural school districts. And I grew up in Arundel. But they really should, because the benefits are huge. The other is, the laws in Maine are, I think, nation-leading in terms of the ability of municipals to do broadband, particularly in rural areas. And there was a law that just got passed that has gotten very little attention, that give municipalities in what are considered unserved or underserved areas a huge leg up, cuts their costs remarkably, because there's something called make ready, which is a big expense, hanging the fiber on the poles, and municipalities get that for free, and that cuts a third to a half the cost of building, and it hasn't gotten much attention. I haven't seen anything about it, but it's a huge leg up potentially for municipalities in rural areas.
And I think it's important to realize, in the case of Baileyville and Calais, the utility owns the network and contracts out for someone to operate the network, maintain the network, and provide ISP services. In the case of South Portland, the arrangement that Fletcher's company has is that they own the network and operate it in South Portland. So there's very many different models. The one that people talk about or they think they're hearing about is municipal broadband networks, and the municipality is going to own, operate, and run the network.
Yeah.
And the way municipalities, especially in Maine, where everybody's very fiscally responsible, everybody's short-staffed anyway. Unless you own an electric company and own the poles and have the techs and have the customer service element, as a municipality, it's very difficult to actually be the provider. And there's people that talk about the state taking over and being the provider, and basically it's the same situation. There are private companies all over the state that have the operational knowledge to run a network, and an example that I came across in preparing for today is there are some really forward-thinking states where rural doctors are at a minimum. And the state is not going into the medical profession, but they're passing legislation to make it appealing for doctors to work in rural areas, whether it's tuition reimbursement, tax credits. And so the role here is for the state to come up with enticements to make it easier for private industry to do that business, because that's what we're good at. If the municipality wants to own it and contract out like they're doing up north, that's great. If a municipality is happy handing off a network to a separate owner and taking whatever revenue or whatever's in their best interest works. There are models that you can't even begin. We're working right now with the town of Alton. And 2 years ago, with ConnectME funds, we built to 69 homes, 36 of which were eligible under the former ConnectME standards. And to get to those eligible homes, we passed another 33, so it made sense to connect them as well. And what that did in Alton was created the haves and the have-nots. We have a capital budget, and we have allocated money to spend here and spend here and spend there, and that was about all we had for Alton at the time. And about a year after the construction was complete and the network was up and running, we had about a 50% take rate and a situation of the haves and have-nots in Alton. And the town manager, town administrator called, and he said, so I have these 2 selectmen out of 3 that want to know how we can build out the rest of the town. And we said, well, we have, this much money scheduled to spend in Alton over the next 2 or 3 years doing projects that we are obliged to under FCC subsidies. But that's all we really have. And he said, well, could we come up with some of the money? And I said, sure. And so we did a quick engineering of the project to come up with a budget, which turned out to be $700,000. And the town has essentially a discretionary fund from tipping fees that they get from a local landfill. And they put a question on their ballot in March to appropriate $150,000 out of that fund, which passed by a vote of 58-2 at the highest attended town meeting in anybody's memory. Usually it's about 12 people. Otelco is committed to $290,000 toward it, and we're in the process of putting an application together for the ConnectME Authority for another $260,000 so that we can install the entire town. Everybody will get free installation. The town will get a credit of enough to basically cover their telephone and internet costs every month for 10 years. That project brought around a call from the Penobscot County executive saying, the county executive for the unorganized territories happens to live in Alton, but she represents Argyle, and she asked me to call you and get a price to build out Argyle. As if I could, look it up in a book and say, okay. So that ball has started rolling, and if I'm a little quiet today, it's because I didn't get home from Argyle until 10 o'clock last night because we did a public meeting there.
Wow.
As part of the planning grant pre-certification checklist, and had an overwhelming response from the public of, yes, we want to do this, let's get the planning grant, figure out what it's going to cost, figure out where the money's going to come from, and next year, once we know what the pots of money are, let's go for a ConnectME grant next year. And I don't want to say it's contagious, but there's a model, and it's contagious.
Broadband envy is real.
And, and every model is different. There's a town in Massachusetts, in western Massachusetts, called Leverett, that 5 or 6 years ago commissioned and built with tax dollars through a bond, a network to serve 800 homes in a very rural town. And they didn't want to operate it, they didn't want to maintain it, so they went to RFP, and they have a local electric company as the operator. And they initially had a single ISP, it's not an open network, and after 2 or 3 years, they weren't happy with the first ISP, and they put out a proposal, an RFP, and we applied, and we've been the ISP for 2 years now, and it's about time to negotiate the next contract for another 3 years, and we just found out last week that they're keeping us, which is very nice. And so we provide all the customer-facing services, customer care, sign up new customers, certain tech support within our NOC, and then if it goes beyond what we need to do because it's network oriented, it gets escalated to HG&E, Holyoke Gas and Electric, who's the operator, and they handle it. And the prices are very reasonable. The town made sure that that happened, universal service. Every house was hooked up from the get-go, and there is an 85% take rate in that town. And there is no cell service to speak of, and Verizon, who is the local provider, has pretty much become non-existent, but that's another model. And so there's just, we've had groups of people in Vermont who said, we want fiber. And we said, we're not building there right now. And they said, well, figure out what it'll cost and we'll pay for it. So right now we're in the process of building to a small subdivision of 11 homes, and 2 homes passed to get there that are essentially chipping in for $58,000 of a build because they want it that bad.
Wow. So, Fletcher, do you think this is how it's going to happen, just town by town? Is that the only path forward that's realistic for connecting the rural parts of the state?
Well, first about Leverett, I happen to have family in Leverett, and you changed their, the network there changed their world.
Wow.
It is absolutely wonderful. Go down there, and it's frequently, and it's great to visit and actually have internet access. So I think Tracy earlier talked about the way the telephone network got started with the, little and that's the same thing that happened with cable, and it's actually the same thing that happened with power in Maine. And so I think this is the way it will start, but it's a constantly moving target. I think as pressure grows and more money becomes available, I think and broadband envy kicks in, you're gonna see that really accelerate, and I think it's quite likely that you're going to see groups of towns. One thing that's a little bit interesting is counties, which don't mean much in Maine, don't matter much in Maine, but the counties, because this is essentially regional, are really kind of stepping up and taking the lead in many of this. And I think you're going to see entire county projects, or hopefully groups of counties do it. So it's definitely started that way. There are many projects actually going on now. It's hard to keep track of them all, but I think it's going to snowball and be bigger. And I also think you're going to see a lot more private money enter over the next couple of years.
Peggy, if I'm a community in a rural area and I want this, I see other communities doing it, and I want to emulate them, how do I get started?
So this really has to be, it really is a grassroots effort. It really has to be the community building on itself. You basically need 3 people in your community, or 3 types of people. It's not just 3 bodies, but 3 types of people.
If it's a small community, it might just be 3.
A broadband champion, or I would refer to it as a broadband zealot. You need somebody who's got some level, or can figure out some level of technology about sort of how it's going to work. And then you need somebody from the government who is going to be part of making sure that your town government is on board with it. And those people, hopefully it's not just 3 because it's a lot of work, are really the people who go out in the community and organize and have conversations with their neighbors. The town of Islesboro, which is an island island off Bar Harbor, it's small, so they really did have 3 people. And one was a woman who recently moved to the island, which all of us who are, not from Maine understand that people from Hawaii, it's even worse on an island. She was not from the island, but she moved there with kids, so she had a little creds. She worked at like 3 jobs on the island. She worked at the library, she worked at the school, and she was that community connection point. All she talked about for 2 years was broadband. Every conversation was littered with why you need broadband in your home. Then they had a town selectman who was also a lobsterman, and then they had somebody else who was technology-based. And those 3 people pulled together a project for Cranberry Isles, which is 3 islands, who had lost their internet connection because somebody sold the house that the wireless thing was on and took it off. And so they had gone for a federal grant through the USDA and had been turned down, but then they went to town meeting, Cranberry Isles, $1.2 million. They got 4 votes against it, 56 votes for it. $1.2 million, these little towns.
Tiny little island.
For a tiny little island. That's a lot of money. They, built the network. They did actually what ended up happening in the end was that there was a little money in the federal pool that got left over, and so they were sort of on the cusp, and so when the grant period ended and they had this chunk of money left over, Cranberry Isles did in fact get a federal grant that paid for it, but they were ready to pay for it themselves, and so that's what every community needs. They need the champion or the champions, because this is a big job. They need somebody who understands town government, who can represent them on town government, and they need people who understand sort of the technology pieces. There's lots of help out there in the technology pieces. All of these companies, GWI, Otelco, Pioneer, Premium, to all of them, and Axiom are willing to help and come into the community and help with some of that real technology pieces, and also sort of facilitate some of the planning pieces. But that's really how they stop. Now, we at ConnectME have a grant that can help with some of the costs around the community planning piece. We this year have broken our grant up into 2 phases because we got the authority to do community planning grants about 4 years ago. I think this is our 4th round. And what we discovered in the first 2 rounds was that the community planning piece takes up a long time and a lot of money. And when they're done, they're not ready to move forward. So we split the grant in half. We now have a community planning piece, and then we have a design phase. And that is really sort of the communities behind it. You've made sort of an idea of where you're going to go. You know what you have. And then the design phase is, what kind of design are you going to use? What is the business model for moving forward? Are you going to create a utility district? Is it going to be municipally owned? Are you going to contract it out? Are you going to... So all of that is in the second phase of the phase 2 grant. And then we have these infrastructure grants. Now, I do want to say, we went across the state last week with the Pew Charitable Trust because they're using Maine as a model of best practices, which I got to say, when they called me and said, we want to come to Maine because you're one of the best practices in the country, I was like, seriously? It just shows you where everybody else is.
Yeah.
We're in the middle, we just opened up our round of grants for this year, okay? We have $740,000. She wants $260. Do a little math. Bowden wants about the same. Shabig wants some. So we don't have a lot of money. And so that is one of our big, we can only do what we can do with $750,000, which is not a lot. We can match grants, but there are going to be a lot of unhappy people at the end of June, and I just want to, caution everybody not to get, because that's all we have. Now, the governor has an additional $2 million in her budget, and there's a potential for bonds. If we get the additional $2 million when the budget is closed, we will have another round, and obviously $2 million is more than 740, so we can do more activities, but we can only do what we can do with the money. We're trying to leverage that money as best as we can by working across the state with providers. We're trying to leverage that money by encouraging communities to really do this planning and get commitment for their community so there can be municipal money in it. But what we got is what we got.
I think there's another important element, and sitting here in Portland, I can't help but want to share it. So at this Argyle meeting last night, we have people that are getting 1.5 megs down by 768 up and trying to live their lives. They can barely send an email. People have businesses in their homes. And sitting here, and even in Gray, it's almost hard to imagine. It would be like somebody living without electricity. And as Peggy said, and Fletcher's mentioned, there's legislation in Augusta that will bring bonds to the public if it gets through the legislature. There's other legislation that will allow municipalities to use TIF funds for broadband infrastructure, and not only within the TIF district, but outside of the TIF district to serve the community. And it's great to be in a place where we can all sit around and complain about our provider, because we hate them all and we all have 3 or 4 choices and we can switch around. And there's people that have one provider or barely one provider. The only thing they can complain about is the fact that they don't have any service. And I just hope that as this legislation makes its way through, the people that are the haves recognize that there's a big portion of the state that's never going to have the opportunity to grow unless the people where the density is come forward and support this kind of infrastructure, because it's critical to the state's growth. And so just the next time you get really mad at your provider because you see that little thing buffering on your screen because there's 12 other devices going on in your house, imagine the person who can't use a smartphone because there's no Wi-Fi and there's no service. So just remember that.
Yeah. You know, talking about the lack of funding for these projects made me think about a few months ago. I know some of us at this table went to a presentation by the USDA Rural Development Office in Maine, and they were basically saying, we've got money and we can't give it away. Like, they were saying, we've got more money than we have applicants, so why aren't more people taking advantage of that?
So we,
That's what they said.
So that is true for the distance learning and telemedicine grants. And Maine has actually been one of the big recipients of the distance and telemedicine grants. It is not true of the distance and telemedicine grants do not pay to connect customers to broadband. So they pay for facilities, they pay for, equipment and facilities, that kind of thing, but they don't pay to connect the patients, which is the piece that we're one of the pieces that we're missing around telemedicine. The other USDA grants that we all hear about, this new program called Reconnect, which do not ask me why the USDA called the program to connect unconnected America, but they did. That program is they've divided, they have $600 million, which sounds like a lot of money until you realize that New York spent $700 million for northern New York. So there are 3 parts to that. There's a grant, a $200 million for grants, $200 million for a grant loan, 50-50, and $200 million for a loan. The grant closes on May 31st. We do have 3 communities applying for that. The application guide is 250 pages long. It is a very complex program, and the provider, Axiom, who's helping those 3 communities, is it's a good thing he's got some hair because he's tearing it all out right now. He really is. He's having a hard time sort of getting through the system with this piece. We have another community that is looking at the 50-50, which is the 3-bridged island, which is Georgetown, Aroustic, and Southport are looking at applying for that. And then the loan program, there's going to be a couple applications from Maine on the loan program, which is in July. So the federal money is, it's great, it's better than, but it's a little chunky, I think would be a nice word for it. It's a little hard to apply for it. There are lots of providers who looked at that grant, and because of the things that USDA requires, many of them said, we can get cheaper money somewhere else.
Not to get in the weeds, but just one irony. The grant is obviously based on different scoring, and there's different elements to the scoring, and one of the elements is that you get points for having less than 6 people, not 6 residents or 6 homes, 6 people per square mile.
Not road mile, square mile.
Square mile. So do that math, okay? 6 people per square mile. But the other thing that you get points for is having businesses and healthcare facilities within the area that you want to build.
To serve those 6 people?
To serve those 6 people. So when you start to do that math, you pick an area and you go, all right, well, we got the 6 people per square mile because it's, up in Aroostook County. But there's not even a CVS for 30 miles. So how do you, to put the time, God bless Axiom, because we looked at it and we were like, we don't even have the manpower to write the grant, let alone report what has to be reported after, and so we passed. Because the ConnectME Authority, and I'm not sucking up because I want a third of her money, but the ConnectME Authority is so much more efficient and it makes so much more sense. That's what the federal government should copy.
Well, we had, when the comment period was open, there were many, many people in many states who said, do this like the CDBG program, give us block grants, because the states are the closest ones to the communities, really, really know what's going on in our state. Do it as a block grant. We can meet the federal, the nationwide requirements that you put on it, but do it as a block grant, and we can make it easier, but they didn't do that.
To what extent is Maine's broadband problem a technology problem? To what extent is an economics problem, a political problem, an education problem, an attitude problem, some other type of problem? What are the primary things that we need to focus on to try to solve this problem? Well, Tracy, do you want to start?
Sure. Maybe it's the marketing person in me, but I don't consider it a problem as much as a challenge. I think that one of the challenges is technology, but not that we don't have it. Obviously, whether it's cable, whether it's DSL, fiber, 5G, 3G, there is technology. What I think is the challenge there is which technology to use and when, and what is its life cycle, because one of the things where wireless is concerned is it's a really good stopgap until you can build fiber to the most outlying areas where the geography makes sense. So we have the technology. Economics, we've been talking about that all morning. It boils down to money and finding a way to make this profitable for private industry. And, we're getting there. There's stuff happening in Augusta that's hopefully going to trickle its way down. Keeping your minds open as a provider of ways to work with communities kind of also helps that. I made notes because while we were emailing back and forth this week with these questions, Fletcher suggested that it would take him 9 hours to answer, so I figured I would write some answers down so I could pop something in. I think one of the important things is education, and we talked about digital inclusion and digital literacy and about the end user where that's concerned, which is very important. If people are afraid of the technology, they're not going to buy it. If there's no demand, it makes it even more difficult for private industry. But in times that I've been in Augusta for various committee meetings where broadband is concerned, I think part of that education is to our legislators, because while they try, they have a lot to learn about all different things that they're worried about and voting on, and I don't think they have a full grasp of what the technology can bring and what's better in places and the pros and cons. So I think that needs to be part of our education. And I think attitude, I mentioned it earlier, there's the haves and the have-nots, and when people in Portland or Lewiston or Saco, where there's a lot of provider service and choices, you just tend to forget that there is a third of the state's population that is essentially unserved, at least by my estimates. Everybody has a different number. So I think the attitude needs to be that everybody in the state kind of needs to pull for everybody in the state. And if you think about it as an employer in a I don't want to say urban, but in a densely populated area, people want to live in the country, and if the connectivity is there, you have access to a workforce because they can telecommute that you may not have here, because there is talent and highly educated people in that area, as I evidenced last night when a software developer came up to me and said, I'd really like to work from my house, but I can't. I have to go to Bangor because I have no signal. So there's a workforce up there that hasn't been tapped because they can't connect. So I think the attitude needs to be, no matter where you are in the state, you need to be able to support this in places where it doesn't exist.
Fletcher, what are your thoughts on this issue?
Now I definitely have to be concise. There are no human endeavors that don't improve with better communication. This is fundamentally, it's the two problems. One is just education, which is digital literacy, and the other is economic digital inclusion. If everybody understood what they could do with the network, how every aspect of what they do, economic, civil, family, whatever, could improve, and they knew how to get the most out of the network, the economics would take care of themselves because the value of the network would be so great, people wouldn't mind paying for it. And the problem is really that people don't know that. And then the other problem is these networks are very powerful. And technology is really powerful, and society is getting split into two halves, the haves and have-nots. And that split is really pretty much along the access and knowledge necessary to use technology. If you have the technology and you know how to use it, you're very powerful, and you are going to be economically successful and more powerful than most people in society. In Maine, those are really the two things that are necessary. The state has always had a role in education, or for at least in New England since the dawn of, or for the last 400 years. And I think that actually driving that and getting people to understand technology, what it does, how they can use it to make their lives better, ultimately will fund the network.
How about you, Peggy?
Yeah, no, we have the education issue. I think the political will is building. There is, there's a lot of demands on all kinds of money, whether it's private money or public money. When we talk about broadband as an infrastructure, we automatically hit up against transportation, and everybody knows how bad the roads are. So there's competition for that resource, and so some of it is really for the role the state needs to play in some of these builds. We need additional funding, and that is an education piece on everybody's part about the importance of this network as an economic driver. And part of that, a huge piece of that, is getting the public to understand what it means to them personally in terms of their job. There are people who understand that, but I was at I don't know where I was, but I was somewhere recently, and somebody said, well, you can just use your cell phone. And I said to him, first off, cell phones are expensive, just like broadband is, and so the assumption that people can use their cell phone with data caps for their kids to do homework is an erroneous one. And your cell phone is not a computer. I mean, even if when they make them this big and they won't fit in your pocket anymore, they're still not a computer. And so really there is an education piece about how we make sure people do have the connectivity that they need.
A cell phone would work if there wasn't fiber to the tower.
Right. Yeah.
I had that discussion actually with a legislative aide this year. He wanted the state to put cell phone antennas on top of fire towers, and I said, you need fiber and power. He said, why? And I said, because it's not magic.
It's not pixie dust.
It's not pixie dust.
Darn it. Well, hey, I'd like to ask you to please thank our great panelists today. They were fantastic.